Imagine two headlines describing the exact same event. City invests $10 million in downtown renewal. And city spends $10 million on downtown redevelopment. Same city, same project, same $10 million. But invests asks you to think about what the city might gain. Spends asks you to think about what the city is giving up. Neither headline has to contain a factual error, and yet they do not invite you to see the same story. That is framing. And framing is one of the most powerful parts of persuasion because it can influence what you think before anyone has explicitly told you what to think. This is reclaiming rhetoric. Today, we are looking at how framing changes what you believe. A frame is the interpretive structure placed around information. It helps determine what deserves attention, what stays in the background, what something should be compared to, and sometimes what kind of thing you believe you are looking at in the first place. Think about an actual picture frame. The frame does not change everything that exists in the room. It determines which portion of the room appears in the picture. Move the frame, and you can produce a very different image from the same reality. Rhetorical framing works in much the same way. Suppose a company announces that 500 employees are losing their jobs. One headline calls it a restructuring designed to improve efficiency. Another says 500 workers lose their jobs in cost-cutting move. These descriptions can refer to the same event. But the first frame centers the organization. Efficiency, strategy, future performance. The second centers the employees, jobs, loss, human consequences. The underlying event has not necessarily changed. The center of attention has. And whatever occupies the center of the frame begins influencing how the rest of the information is interpreted. This is why framing is more than choosing positive or negative words. A frame can change the question itself. Imagine a debate about remote work. One person asks, how much flexibility should employees have? Another asks, how should companies maintain productivity and accountability? Someone else asks, why should employees spend hours commuting to work they can perform from home? And another asks, what happens to collaboration when co-workers rarely share the same physical space? They may all be discussing the same policy, but they are not beginning from the same rhetorical location. Each frame establishes a different problem. And once the problem changes, different evidence starts feeling relevant. If the problem is flexibility, commute time and employee satisfaction matter. If the problem is productivity, output and performance metrics matter. If the problem is collaboration, communication and team cohesion move to the center. Communication scholar Robert Entman famously described framing in terms of selection and salience. Out of everything that could be said about an issue, a communicator selects certain aspects and makes them more noticeable. That selection can influence how people define the problem, what causes they identify, what judgments they make, and which solutions seem reasonable. Consider the phrase tax relief. The word relief already contains a miniature argument. Relief is what you receive from something unpleasant. Pain relief, stress relief, debt relief. Once taxation is framed as something from which people need relief, the language quietly suggests how taxation should be understood. Compare that with public contribution. Now, the frame points toward participation in something shared. Neither phrase gives you a complete argument about taxes, but each makes certain arguments easier to build. Framing can also influence judgment through comparison. Imagine a medical treatment described in two ways. 90% of patients survive, or 10% of patients die. Mathematically, those statements can describe the same outcome. Psychologically, they may not feel identical. One directs attention toward survival. The other directs attention toward mortality. This is one version of what researchers call the framing effect, and it reveals something important about human judgment. Information rarely reaches us as raw data. It arrives organized, named, compared, emphasized, and placed inside a context. Here is the warning. Recognizing framing does not mean assuming every frame is dishonest. It is impossible to communicate without framing. You cannot include every fact, every perspective, every cause, every consequence, and every possible interpretation every time you speak. Selection is unavoidable. So the useful question is not, is this framed? The answer is almost always yes. Better questions are, what does this frame emphasize? What does it minimize? What assumptions does it make feel natural? And what changes if I move the frame? Take a protest. Describe it as demonstrators disrupting traffic, and attention moves toward inconvenience and public order. Describe the same event as citizens demanding political change, and attention moves toward grievances and civic participation. Neither frame automatically tells you whether the protest is justified, but each creates a different starting point for judgment. This is where framing becomes especially powerful in politics, advertising, news, workplace communication, and social media. If you can define the situation, you often gain an advantage before the argument even begins. A company does not have a price increase. It has a pricing adjustment. A product is not cheap. It is affordable. A rule is either the consumer protection or a government restriction. An employee is either experienced or set in their ways. A new technology is either automation or replacement. The description does not merely identify the subject. It positions the subject. So when you encounter a persuasive message, try removing the frame. Translate emotionally loaded language into something more neutral. Ask how someone with a different goal would describe the same event. Look for information that has been pushed outside the picture. And pay particular attention to the question you are being invited to answer. Because sometimes the most persuasive part of an argument is not the answer. It is the question that was chosen before the answer ever appeared. The same principle matters when you are making an argument. You are choosing a frame whether you realize it or not. You are deciding where the story begins, which facts receive emphasis, what the audience should compare, what language names the problem, and what kind of response seems reasonable. That does not automatically mean manipulation. A frame can clarify. It can distort. It can reveal something important, or hide something equally important. The skill is learning to notice which one is happening. Once you start seeing frames, headlines stop looking neutral. Labels stop looking accidental. Questions stop looking innocent. And arguments begin revealing decisions that were made before the evidence ever reached you. A frame does not necessarily change the facts. It changes which facts you see first, what they seem to mean, and what you are prepared to believe next. Change the frame, and sometimes you change the entire argument.